Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, and I can't tell you how excited I am to be here to celebrate the book birthday of the Women of Arlington Hall with Jane Healey, who has brought along her friend, Suzanne Nelson, to be in conversation with her. And Suzanne's book, The Librarians of Lisbon, I mean, come on, I'm a librarian.
Yes.
I mean, I was like very thrilled that this combination happened. So, anyways, we'll be talking all about the Women of Arlington Hall and the Librarians of Lisbon in the next hour. But in the meantime, I just want to say really quickly, thanks to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. We couldn't do this fun stuff without them. I'd also like to thank Jane and Suzanne who let us share this program with other libraries, because if anybody knows me, you know I'm going to say when libraries work together, we make magic. And this is, I think, probably one of my most magical programs in the last year. I'm so excited. Um, anyway, so if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your screen. I will be moderating questions to Jane and Suzanne after their talk of about 30, 40 minutes about the book. If you want to just chat with each other, you are welcome to do that in the chat. You can buy signed books by Jane from Bookends in Winchester. And Suzanne, I think you're going to have to email her to get a signed book plate, but I will send out a link of where you can buy her books from bookshop.org, one of our very favorite sort of like nonprofit books, online booksellers. So that's really exciting. So as I said, Suzanne wrote The Librarians of Lisbon, which should be on all of your TBR lists. We were just talking about it. It sounds fascinating. It has librarians in it. It has Lisbon in it. I mean, what could you not, And Jane is one of my favorite people. She does a program with us on recommending historical fiction book recommendations once a month. But when she told me that this book was coming out on August 1st, I had to go see her at her launch in Winchester on Friday. And I was blown away. I was absolutely blown away. And so will you be today? If you want to put like some head blowing emojis around, I'm happy with it. I'm good with it. So Jane, Suzanne, so thank you so much for being here. I can't wait for this talk.
Mina, you are the sweetest. You're such a rock star. Thank you for doing this. This is awesome. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. And Suzanne Nelson, I'm so thrilled to have her here. Librarians of Lisbon is a book about women trailblazers as well, espionage. So many great things about it. We were just talking about it's a little bit spicy romance, which is awesome. So you have to check that out too. Thank you, Suzanne, for doing this tonight.
Oh, thank you so much. And Jane, I'm so excited to be here. Mina, thank you for having me. And I'm very excited to talk about the Women of Arlington Hall with you. So I read this as an advanced reading copy some months ago, and I absolutely fell in love with this book. So I can't wait for us to chat about it together tonight. So let's just dive in, and we'll talk a little bit about your initial inspiration for the Women of Arlington Hall. I know in your author's note, because I always read author's notes because I find the origin stories so fascinating. You mentioned Liza Mundy's article about codebreakers during the Cold War, women codebreakers during the Cold War. And I think that this novel has come out at such a precipitous time because when you and I were chatting earlier today, you mentioned that tomorrow is the 80th anniversary of Hiroshima. And in the late 1940s, post World War II, and early 1950s, you had this amalgamation of all these events involving Russia impacting the United States, atomic bomb secrets and the Cold War and the Red Scare and McCarthyism and all of these intersecting factors. So why don't you just walk us through a little bit of what your inspiration was and why this so impassioned you?
Yeah, thank you. So again, thank you for doing this. I came across this article in the Smithsonian Magazine in 2018, and it was about female code breakers at Arlington Hall in Arlington, Virginia, which was the head of U.S. military intelligence in World War II. I mean, in World War II, and then beyond into the Cold War years, and actually even beyond that. And so I read about these women, and the article centered around this woman, Angeline Nani. She was 99 years old at the time of the article. She was the last female code breaker from a project called the Venona Project that was top secret. Like even within Arlington Hall, it was top secret, and it was predominantly women. And these women And their mission in this group was to crack the codes, crack the Russian codes of the telegrams that were going back and forth from Moscow to spies in the U.S. and try to track down the spies that were still in the U.S. after World War II. So Angeline Nanny in this article, like she was 99, she was still like full of life, had all her marbles, had amazing stories, and talked about how she formed this like group of this family of friends because they worked together. They often lived together. There was dormitories down the street from Arlington Hall called Arlington Farms that a lot of the women lived. And they formed these great friendships and they also made history, cracking the Russian codes and tracking down Russian spies in the United States. So I had the article in 2018 and I held on to it for a long time because I just couldn't quite find my way into the story, but I knew that there was a story there. So, 7 years later, it finally happened. But you know how it is, Suzanne. Like it takes a while sometimes for things
Yes,
to marinate,
yeah.
and to figure out how are you gonna write this story.
Yes, and it's so important for ideas like that to actually marinate because I think that actually makes for a better book in the long run when you have time to sit with it. But you mentioned the Venona Project, and I know before I read this book that I had never actually heard the term Venona Project before. So I'm sure that there are lots of readers out there who would love to know what that actually was in more specific terms. And I think you have some fun slides to share with us
I
too.
do. Thank you. Yeah, so I have some slides. The Venona Project was this group who was their one mission was to decode the unbreakable Russian coded messages and to track down spies in the US. And so that was their one mission. But this Russian code, their coded messages that were going back and forth as telegrams were considered unbreakable because the encryption was so complex and sophisticated. And so I'm going to pull up my slide to explain. One of the reasons that people haven't heard about the Venona Project before is because it was only declassified in 1995. Um, Here, let me see if I can get my slides up.
And that to me was
Um,
so fascinating when I
yeah,
read that in your author's note. And what a gold mine of information that was when it was declassified. I mean, when you
yes.
were doing research for this, it must have felt like you were hitting the jackpot in a way of interesting, fascinating facts about Cold War code breaking.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And, and 95 wasn't that long ago. So, and there's still parts of the Venona project that have not been declassified. But when I started really researching this project in earnest, I reached out to the historian at the NSA. The Arlington Hall was basically the precursor to the NSA. It was the Army Military Intelligence. And they sent me this little pamphlet. This is the cover of the pamphlet. And they also sent me a bound book of all of the Russian telegrams that they decoded
Wow.
and the translated messages that came out of them. So that was like, as doing research, that was like hitting the lottery. That was so interesting. Very dense, but really interesting.
Yeah, I bet.
So, but the Venona Project, is still now considered one of the greatest counter-espionage triumphs of the Cold War. And 90% of the women, 90% of the people involved in the Venona Project were women. This is one of the tips. These pictures are all like pictures from Arlington Hall. I'm going to move this happened to us this morning, Susanna, so I can actually read my text. So during World War II, the US had started compiling copies of all of the Soviet telegrams that were coming back and forth between Moscow and the US. And the government didn't know what to do with them. They were all encrypted, but they knew that they should hold on to them, so they just started sending them to Arlington Hall. So thousands and thousands of messages, something like over 3,000 messages a week at one point, and they would just file them away in file cabinets because computers you couldn't store them anywhere else. And that the top secret group was formed kind of towards the end of the war to start to decipher and read these encrypted telegrams. Let's see.
That's so fascinating, and I love that picture. We decided earlier that we did not know what those machines were, but I
Yeah.
mean that's so fascinating that they were working at machines like
Yeah,
that.
I don't know what those machines were. They might have been Cyrillic like typewriters, Russian
Yeah.
language typewriters. They also had these massive IBM punch card machines to compare groups. But that was one of the things that fascinated me. That was one of the only things they had in terms of technology. I mean, if you look at the screen at the picture over here, it was painstaking work, and all most of it by hand. And it was one of the articles I read. They described it as the Russian messages were like a billion pieces in a jigsaw puzzle, and all of them black. And so this group was by 1945, so not even the end of the war. The Venona Project was up and running, but they really were making very slow
Mhm.
progress. And then they hired Meredith Gardner away from another code breaking group, and that's when things changed.
And
So
Meredith Gardner was one of my favorite characters in the book. And for those of you that have not read it yet, you're in for a really big treat when he's introduced, and then also when one of my other favorite characters is introduced, Sissel.
yeah,
I love
yeah.
both of them.
Thank you. Yeah, so one of the things I loved researching this is, Arlington Hall. It was a lot of brilliant people, but a lot of them were really quirky. And Meredith Gardner, I mean, I found this picture and I'm like, of course he's going in the novel. Like, not only was he the head of the Venona Project, but he was really quirky. Probably would be described as neurodivergent today. He was recruited as a linguist by the Army in 42. He is, I mean, even at this young age, I think he was in his early 30s here, he was considered a legend in the field of code breaking. He spoke at least 9 languages. One source had him at speaking like 12 languages. Just a really interesting guy. He was working originally in World War II with the German code breaking group. And then they transferred him to the Japanese code breaking group. And even though he didn't speak Japanese, he taught himself to speak Japanese fluently in 3 months. So that shows you like
Wow.
how brilliant and gifted he was.
Wow. So what sources, I'm just curious, what sources did you have when you were researching his personality? Were there letters and things that he'd written or a nonfiction book that you read that really gave great insight into his character?
There's a number of articles. The NSA has some archived materials about him. Howard Bloom wrote a book called In the Enemy's House, which talks about the Venona Project specifically, nonfiction, obviously. And then there was another book called The KGB FBI War by Robert Lamphere, and that was another source that really described who Meredith Gardner was. Like, he was not always easy to work with. He was abrasive. He did not suffer fools. Like, he was smart. I mean, you look at him, he's pretty confident in the situation. Like, he's a pretty confident guy. Could not deal with anyone, could not deal with foolishness or people who weren't like operating at the same level as him intellectually.
Yeah.
So just a really, really interesting character in history.
Yeah.
So when he came on board, his leadership and his brilliance led to some really major breakthroughs for the team. They started being able to decipher and translate these Russian messages. And decided he was going to try to recreate the Russian code book so that they could transfer even more of them. And so as they were doing this and making progress, they started to discover real names, including real names of scientists who were working on the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb in these messages, in these Russian messages,
Hmm.
and also names of spies by code name. So certain names, code names just kept on coming up. Liberal was one of them, Rest was another one. And at that point, the team knew they had to bring in the FBI to start some investigations because they had real evidence now which is something they never really thought that they would discover.
Hmm.
So this is Robert Lamphere. He was the liaison to the FBI. They brought him in, and Meredith and Robert at first, there was like you couldn't have a more like odd couple, and this is another reason I loved this story. They were a total. Robert Lamphere was like athlete, Midwestern, very friendly, very flirtatious, great with people, And Meredith was an intellectual and an introvert, and like at first wanted nothing to do with him, wanted nothing to do with the FBI because he knew the project net at that point was getting out of his control. And he was also kind of nervous about like what else they would discover and what it would lead to. And so eventually Meredith and Robert start working together and getting along. And that's when even more breakthroughs happen. And so the FBI starts launching investigations, trying to track down all these spies and various spy networks across the United States. Because I should mention too, like you talked about at the beginning the cultural context, right? So
Yeah.
it's early Cold War. There's Senator McCarthy is accusing all these Hollywood people of being spies and anti-communist, but at the same time, there actually were a number of hundreds of Soviet spies still in the U.S. after the war that were that had not been discovered up until that point. There was over 300 that they identified from these messages that they were
Yeah.
trying to track down. And McCarthy did not know, Senator McCarthy did not know about the Venona Project. Neither did the president. Neither did Truman at the
Yeah.
time because the FBI was concerned about spies in the White House, actually
Yeah.
working in the White House.
Yeah, that just astounded me because you mentioned that in your author's note too. And I could not fathom that the President of the United States did not know about this massive code breaking project that we were undertaking to get
Yeah,
these Russian spies. That just seemed crazy to me.
it was crazy. And it shows you J. Edgar Hoover was the head of the FBI at the time, and it shows you the power he had. He was well aware of the Venona Project and
Yeah,
kept abreast of everything that went on in it. But yeah, he made the decision not to tell the president, which I thought was pretty astounding.
that is.
So I love an underdog story, and these, to be clear, like Meredith Gardner and Robert Lanphier of the FBI were not like high level people in their organizations. They were kind of middle managers, and the people working under them, a lot of them were like in their 20s, first job out of college, and they were able to break the unbreakable Russian codes, and their progress started exploding, and they started identifying these code names of the spies in the US, including the atomic spy ring in the US, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg being a part of that. And it's still considered one of the most like historic, achievements in cryptology in the United States ever. So I thought that was really like that was one of the things that like when you read this article, I'll read the first paragraph. The American intelligence establishment today unveiled this was in 95, and unveiled one of its oldest secrets, how a small team of codebreakers found the first clues that the Soviet Union sought to steal the blueprints for the atomic bomb in World War II.
Yeah.
And so that this whole like underdog story and their successes was fascinating. But you and I, we write about unknown or lesser known women in
Yeah.
history. And so I was really interested in the women of the Venona Project. Like I said, 90% of the code breakers at Arlington Hall were women. And they were young, they were often from small towns, and many were former teachers. Some of them went to prestigious colleges, some of them didn't go to college at all. And one of this wasn't a qualification, but one of the similarities among the women, they all had a powerful command of languages. Many of them were brilliant at math. And this is a funny story. So this picture is not from any Arlington Hall archives. My editor, Nancy, who I inherited, I got assigned to her after my other editor left. And she's like, you're not going to believe it, but my husband's grandmother was a code breaker at Arlington
Oh,
Hall.
oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
so this is her on the end here, and this is all her friends. She
Oh,
sent me these most amazing pictures. So
that is unbelievable.
yeah, so it's like she's all over like my website and like in my like swag. Yeah, so
Oh my
it
gosh.
was really crazy.
That
So
is
yeah,
crazy. Talk about everything coming full circle and the serendipity of life. It's right there.
exactly. So that is that's the slide part of the presentation, and but yeah, that kind of sums up like the historical background for this story.
Yeah. Oh, that's so great. Thanks for sharing the slides. And I that was one of my favorite things about the book actually was about the female friendships and the women characters in the story. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the inspiration that you drew from for the characters' personalities. And I know some of them are based loosely on some of the real women like Jean, who actually worked in Arlington Hall for a period of time. Um, and I just think, we can talk a little bit about the context in which these women were working in their time frame too, because I know when I was writing the Librarians of Lisbon, I kept returning to the fact that, on the home front during World War II, women had opportunities opening up to them, domestically, working in factories and things, munitions factories and stuff like that. But they were still, a lot of them were tied to apron strings, and that was the expectation. And if they went to college, it was just to be an entertaining conversation piece at their husbands' dinner tables. And so, to go abroad and be a spy in Lisbon, it opened up this whole new universe of possibilities to educated women. And I think that's, if you want to speak to that with regards to Arlington Hall, I think it was true to this book too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was one of the reasons I thought we would be good in conversation about this because your book is also about women who made an unusual and kind of rare choice, right? To go abroad and take this risk and in this very unusual job. And these code breaking jobs were very risky and unusual. And Angeline Nani in the article, she was one of them, and there were several like this. They created this family of friends. They were all very quite close and they were kind of married to the job. Like she
Yeah.
never married. She worked, Venona Project kept going until they shut it down in 1980. So like a lot of these women kept working and then some of them moved on to higher positions in the CIA and the NSA. But yeah, I think that I'm always interested in women who are like not only trailblazers, but just like make that just unusual choice, right? Like that road less traveled type of choice.
Yeah, yeah. And the other thing that I have found really fascinating over the course of my research when I think about espionage and code breaking women, like for the Librarians of Lisbon, they recruited academics and people who were of a scholarly mindset because of the way that their brains worked, because
Mhm.
they had this ability to make connections from seemingly really abstract tidbits of information, and they could comb through telephone directories and pick out, names of Gestapo leaders and, all these unusual ways in which academic minds can kind of hone in on information. And I mean, in a sense, I guess like we do that a little tiny bit maybe as historical fiction writers when we're researching, we in on a really exciting idea and then we go down the rabbit hole to do our research. But code breaking minds, I mean, that was one of the things that I found really fascinating about the Women of Arlington Hall too, was at the very beginning of the book you describe kind of a little bit about the process of recruitment and some of the tests that they underwent and how their brains worked.
Mhm.
I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, but that was super fun. At least when I read it, I thought it was.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I mean a lot of them had, like I said, not they didn't all necessarily go to college, but their brains worked in similar ways. So a lot of them were quite good at math puzzles and crossword puzzles, and a lot of them were musical. If you had a musical ability, there was something about having a musical ability that often made you a good code breaker.
Yeah.
Um, what you talked about memory, one description described as having like a magpie memory, like the ability to like gather and remember facts, almost like a photographic memory sometimes.
Yeah.
And pattern recognition, being able to like look at rows and rows and pages of numbers and have those patterns jump out at you in a way that doesn't happen for everybody. Certainly doesn't happen for me. So
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
no, me
yeah.
either. Me either. I would not have been a good code breaker.
No, me neither. But so that was really fascinating to me. Like it wasn't necessarily, although a lot of them did go to college and all were fluent in multiple languages, and had, amazing academic backgrounds. Some of them didn't, but they just had those traits.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as far as research went, I mean, I know you did incredibly extensive research for this. And as you mentioned, you got some really great firsthand documents that they gave you right at the beginning of your research process. What other research tactics did you use? Because when I was reading the descriptions of Arlington Hall itself and then Arlington Farms,
Hmm.
I love the descriptions of the settings, and I also thought it was so interesting that, it kind of had a dormitory setup, but then it also didn't it have a bowling alley, and it had, all these a little shop where you could buy, toiletries and sundries and things, or do a little grocery shopping. So it kind of was a community that was self-supportive, right? In a
Yes,
way.
yeah. Arlington Hall was pretty massive. I mean, at its height, and I don't know if this was during the Cold War or right before it, it had 8,000 employees. So it's pretty big. And it was, you can look up the Arlington Hall main building online. It was formerly an all-girls school. But during the war, when the military and the government took it over, they put, fencing and barbed wire and guards, and they added like very cheaply added some new buildings in the back, and then it also had a bowling alley, and like you said, like it had a dispensary, it had a barber shop and a beauty salon. Like it was, yeah, it was like a college campus in a way. And I think part of it was because these people worked so many hours. If you read the book, like they worked all the time, and so it was like at least they could go get a haircut like across the street from the office, and not have to leave the campus of Arlington Hall once they got there. So,
Yeah, yeah. And it was also I loved Kat's kind of introduction, your main heroine. She's such an indomitable figure, and she's so strong and independent. She comes to the story after breaking off an engagement, and then you have this kind of journey of just self-discovery that she goes on, and she gains confidence as the book goes on too, because she's coming up against these men that, there's a few times that they're so condescending to her, and they just kind of underestimate the information that she is, they don't even wait for her to speak. They basically just assume that what she's going to say is unimportant, and she
yes,
has to prove them wrong.
yes,
And, talking about the culture of women at that time, even in a place where they were valued for their intelligence, they still came up against these walls sometimes, and they still had to break the ceilings.
yes, yes. And I will say there were some things I read that where they say, oh, women were treated better at Arlington Hall than most places, but still it's the 40s, right? It's the late 40s, early 50s, and she was young. And so like and Meredith Gardner, I think he was like that with a lot of these people who first joined when they first joined, he was like, well, they're not probably not going to last. Are they even any good at this? So you really had to earn his respect and trust. And it took some time.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't know if I asked you this already, but did you get a chance to visit? I mean, does it still exist? Does Arlington Farms and Arlington Hall still exist as a building?
Arlington Farms does not. Arlington Hall does. I did not because it's a school of foreign service now.
Okay.
And so I knew, like, I actually have a friend from high school that I'm like I could have pulled some strings there, but there was just so many amazing vintage photos and descriptions and thing availability for on the NSA site. They have historical archives that I was like. I felt like I had enough to get a picture of what it was back then because I'm sure it's quite different today. And just the pictures of all these, like a couple of the ones I showed tonight, all these women working at tables with like spreadsheets and index cards and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
The smell of the place they described, the outbuildings, which is where the Venona Project was not in the main beautiful columned building that was Arlington Hall. It was in one of the makeshift buildings that was built during the war, and they talked about it being cold all winter and hot, like hot as anything in the summer, no air conditioning, but not very good heat either. So,
Oh my
all things,
gosh.
little things like that, like it gives you a sense of what it was like.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess there weren't any diaries or letters from that time period from the women who worked there because it was all classified.
Right. Yeah, there wasn't a lot, but I will say Liza Mundy's Code Girls, which is more about the women, the code breakers in World War II, but like
Yeah.
that book, she is an incredible researcher and writer. So she describes a lot of things about working there and life that life for these women during the war, which was not that different in the late 40s and 50s after the
Yeah.
war. So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so what was the most challenging part for you as a writer in taking on the Women of Arlington Hall when you were undertaking the research and then the drafting process? Was there a big stumbling block that you had trouble overcoming? Or, I mean, what were the most rewarding and challenging parts of it for you as you were in the active process of drafting and revising?
my first answer is like all of
I
it's,
know, right?
every part of it is bad. No, but I will say that one of the reasons it took me a while, like, I held on to this article since 2018. One of the most challenging parts was I knew, in writing we talk about showing and not telling. I knew I had to I couldn't just be like, oh, she's a code breaker without kind of going into what code breaking is and people like to learn about work to a degree, because code breaking is really boring at a
Yeah.
certain level. Like it's so tedious, especially back then. So it was like, how do I balance explaining and showing what kind of work this involved without boring the audience to tears, right? Like
Yeah.
just how do I balance that out? And that was I actually taught myself at a very basic level how they did it. There's a Nova special called something like Secret Lies and Spies from like 30 years ago that talks about the Venona Project and how they did this code breaking at a very base level again. Because I wanted people to understand that it was incredibly tedious, but also incredibly sophisticated and hard, and not everyone could get a hang of it. And so that was the most that, out of all the challenging parts of writing and putting this together, I think just being able to kind of lay the groundwork in the first few chapters of what the work was
Yeah.
without going overboard and putting people to sleep. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that was one of the things that I actually really appreciated as I was reading it too, was you in the typeset book itself, there are some of the words that they're trying to decode in different
Hmm.
phases.
Yeah.
And I do not have a code breaking brain at all either. So that actually was super helpful. And it made it so accessible, but I would imagine that that was incredibly challenging, how to get that down to something that isn't going to completely baffle, 99% of the everyday population who are not Meredith Gardner.
Right. Well, exactly. And I think that that's one thing. Like, I remember going to, we were just talking about Historical Novel Society conference, and one of the panels was like, your author's note is your best friend. And so,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, I had to keep reminding myself, like, this is a novel, this is fiction. Like, I can simplify it because, I talk about one report where they sent all this information about these atomic spies to the upper levels of the FBI and the government. And but there was like hundreds of reports, but you can't talk about like hundreds of reports.
Right.
There are things you need to like kind of simplify for the sake of the story to make it
Right.
an entertaining story that's not 700 pages long. So
Right. Right.
yeah.
Yeah. And that's a choice. I mean, when I was working on the Librarians of Lisbon, I had to make similar choices about, because a lot of my characters were based on historical figures, but I wasn't actually using their real names, and I was fictionalizing aspects of their future, but keeping, nonfiction aspects of their backstory. And it just kind of became this mishmash of fiction and nonfiction. So how did you, I mean, did you have a set of rules or anything in the back of your mind when you were making those choices? Things that historical facts that maybe you didn't want to touch about real people where you decided intentionally to fictionalize?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have, right? As
Yeah.
historical fiction writers. I knew that you can't have a book about breaking the Russian codes and the Venona Project without having Meredith Gardner and Robert Lanphier. Like you had to have them. Like they were so like pivotal and central to the story. So I knew they would be characters in the book. But then I also, my last novel, Good Night from Paris, was biographical fiction, and the main character, Drew Layton, was a real woman in history, and I felt very confined by that, to be
Yeah.
honest. Like it was really challenging. You can't like color outside the lines, you know? So this time I knew I wanted the main, like Kat Killeen and her friends to be composites of the many different women of Arlington Hall that I read about,
Yeah.
and so that gave me the freedom to write their stories without being like, oh, but she wasn't at this place or this isn't her age, all of those things that we obsess about as writers.
Yeah, no, I know because I made the same choices with Celine and B, the two spies
Yeah,
in Lisbon,
that's
because
right.
there were just there were too many women and they were all scattered in different areas of Europe and they were all on different missions
Mhm.
and so that's what I ended up doing too, was doing composites of, drawing inspiration from little tidbits from different actual spies and then fictionalizing.
Yes,
Um, but that, I mean, that's a playground in a way too, because that just gives us license to do some fun things too.
exactly.
Um,
Yeah, yeah,
so, so when you were writing about the code breakers in the Cold War, we talk about them as I mean, they had the same skill set as these men did, but their road to get there was was harder.
yeah,
But again, I think one of the really rewarding things about them and their job was that they were working together. They
hmm
had each other in this environment at Arlington Farms to fall back on.
yes,
Um,
that's right. Yeah,
and
I think,
I feel like in a lot of ways, like your books have kind of this theme of female solidarity and friendship running through them. The Beantown Girls did, and then even Drew's story, she relied on a lot of women to survive in her
yeah.
predicament in that book. And you kind of did the same thing in Arlington Hall at different points too. Um, is that something that you would say you're passionate about?
Yeah, I think definitely. And I think, and thank you. And I think too, I hadn't written about a group of friends since Beantown Girls, like a true group of friends, right? Like, Drew has her support system and even Secret Stealers, Anna has her support system. But I wanted to write like about a group of friends who go through this experience together because that first original article with Angeline Nanny, and there's a character in the book Gia who's kind of loosely based on Angeline Nanny.
Yeah.
Um, she talked about like, and they'd like make some big breakthrough, and Judith Copeland was the first spy identified. She was working at the Justice Department, and they arrested her based on based on Arlington Hall Venona Project, what was found, and her name was on every newspaper in the country the next morning. And then Angeline was like, and then we just like went out to bowling and like whatever, you know what I mean? It was like just a day in the, another day's work, which
Yeah.
I was like, that's so interesting. Like that, they just like, yep, part of the job. Like even though they were like making history and finding spies, it was all like a day, day in the life. Yeah.
I know. And that was one of the things that I also found the women were all so endearing, but I think that was part of what made them that way was that they all worked these insanely long hours and their brains were just going and going and going. And then they all get dressed up and they go out dancing
Yeah.
and having a good time together, and trying on dresses. So you get these moments where they're so utterly human and detached from their missions and their jobs,
Yeah. Yeah.
which
And
is
I think that it was just a release. Like they just
yeah,
needed that release of like being with their friends, hanging out in the dorm, like having a good time and putting aside, like putting the work in a box for a little while sometimes,
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and also one of the really refreshing aspects of the book too, which we really haven't touched on, is the romance, and we can't really give away too much about it for people that have not read it yet. But that was one of my favorite parts of the book was
Thank you.
was the and the big looming question of, are they going to get together, and how can they, forbid there's a little forbidden love flavor in there between Kat and Jonathan. So we won't give anything away, but I loved his character too.
Oh,
Um,
thank you.
yeah.
Yeah, I wanted, I wanted, the other thing about Good Night from Paris is it's a true story, and she had a hard, the ending is very bittersweet because she had a hard road in the
Yeah.
war and the years after. And so when I remember hitting the end on that book, and I'm like, that's it. Next one, happily ever after. Like, I want a big romance. I want a Hollywood ending. I want to like, I want more creative freedom.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I thought a lot about like what I wanted this book to be that was different than my last project, and those were some of the things I wanted like a, will they or won't they rivals
Yeah.
kind of romance. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was very well done, and I loved it. And it balanced out all the other things that were happening with the code breaking and the suspense and espionage aspect. So that was great.
Thank you.
Um, so what are you working on anything now?
We not as much as you. Like Suzanne has like a bazillion projects going right now. I'm like circling different projects in terms of research, but I haven't nailed anything down that's like nothing's like really bubbled up to the surface where I'm like, that's my next project.
Yeah.
I usually bounce things off my agent before we go to my editor about anything. But yeah, I'm trying. I'm
So,
trying.
so let's talk about the process of that for a minute because, what do you do when you're in that area where you're searching for the next one? Because I'm always I don't know what you do, but I comb, like newspapers.com, and
Yeah.
I'll be reading some random article about something, and then there'll be a mention of some person, and then I'll go down that rabbit hole, and
Yes.
I'll
Yeah.
think, oh my gosh, who was this person? Now I have to find out, and can I write about her? What?
Right, right, right. Yeah. And
So do you
I
do something similar?
yeah, and I just kind of keep a running file and then I kind of like rank them like in terms of like, okay, because you know all this all too well. Like whatever the next idea is, like you have to live with it for a long time.
Yeah.
So like you better be passionate about it because I feel like readers will know if you're not. You have to be passionate about the story and excited about it and put your heart into it. And if I don't feel that, and then I know I have to let it go, But I do the same thing. I keep kind of running lists once in a while. Like there was something on YouTube my husband was watching the other night, and I was like, "What was that?" Like, so just trying to like. But yeah, I've got a few things percolating, but nothing definite yet.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure everyone, including me, is very excited to know what is coming next.
Thank
Um,
you.
and good luck with all of the rabbit holes of research. And one other fun thing that we can talk about before we take questions is what are we reading right now? What are we both reading? Can we talk about that?
Oh yeah. So I am reading because it was keeps kept popping up on Amazon. The Oligarch's Daughter, and I really need to look up the author's name.
Yeah.
And it was very well reviewed, and it's good. I'm listening to it and reading it at the same time, which I like to do sometimes to get through more books. Joseph Finder is his name. That's a good that's what I'm reading. I read The Wedding People because
Yeah.
um it's such a like in the zeitgeist right now. So I'm like I had to read that to see what the all the buzz was about.
Yeah. That's
And
on
that
my TBR too. So it's
yeah,
sitting
that
on
was
my
a good
nightstand.
audiobook as well. Like I
Yeah.
recommend that. How about you? What are you reading?
Well, I always have multiple books going, but I'm audiobook when I'm walking my dog is Jodi Picoult's By Any Other Name, which I've been wanting to
Uh
read for a really long time. So I'm right at the tail end of that and love it because I love Shakespeare and love the idea of a woman, secretly writing some of his works.
yep.
And then I am reading The Master Jeweler by Wayne Randell. By your friend, by
Oh, by
Wayne, because
Wayna.
yes.
Beautiful writer. Yeah,
Yes.
he's the
So I
best.
picked it up at the Historical Novel Society conference in June when
Ah,
I was there, and I just love it. I'm about 50 pages, 60 pages from the end, so totally love it.
yeah, she's
Um,
so super talented and such a lovely person too. So.
yeah. Yeah. So before we open it up to questions, is there anything else that you want to tell us before we open it up?
Oh yeah, no. Well, first of all, Suzanne, you're amazing, and thank you for doing this. And everyone should read The Librarians of Lisbon. I can't recommend it enough.
Thank you.
And I will say I Zoom with book clubs all over the country, and my tech department has been set up a forum on my website. So if you're interested in having me visit you virtually on Zoom, you just fill out the form and we make it work from there. If you do read it, even if you don't have me visit, no pressure. I will say if your book club is reading it, and you would like a book club guide, I have these handy dandy book club guides that my friend designed for me. It has like book club questions and it has a Spotify playlist and even has a drink that you can make. So
Oh, that's great.
I
I
have
have the
those as
drink
well.
recipe.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, so I'm happy to send you a book club guide, and you can also download the digital version on my website. But this
Oh.
has been amazing. It's thank you again, Suzanne, and thank you, Mina, rockstar librarian Mina, for setting this up.
Well, I'm happy to. And I was just listening in and picking up more details for things, which is just fascinating. I do want to get to some questions, and I want to remind people to put your questions in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of the screen, so I don't miss them. Sharon had asked kind of early on about where you came up with the names, because I was thinking about Meredith. That was a very common male name back in the 40s, but it's obviously not considered a male name now. But the rest of you, how did you come up? How do you generally come up with names?
Yeah, so Meredith, and people were like, oh, I had a hard time. Like a couple people have been like, I had a hard time remembering that Meredith was not a woman, I mean, again, he was a real person in history. I couldn't change Meredith's name. But in terms of naming, I try to pick names of like, I think about like how old would Kathleen and her friends be, and then I look at the birth records. Back 25 years back from that and see like what names were popular. I also try not to have the same names start with the same letter if it's like in terms of main characters, because I feel like when I'm reading a book and it's like Ron and Richard and whatever, like all like our names, like I get them confused sometimes. So I like to keep each name have a different starting letter if I can.
Smart. I've gotten confused by that before myself. Um, how about you, Suzanne? Do you have a particular way of picking names?
So I have a trusty little book of baby names that I use, but I also use a system similar to Jane for my historical fiction where I go back and I look at census records and what popular names were the year, around about the year that they would be born. And in the Librarians of Lisbon, I actually tried to keep, there's a spy in there, a double agent named Gable, and I tried to keep his name very similar to the actual real life double agent spy who was Double Agent Garbo, who was one of like the most famous double agents of all time in World War II. So I intentionally kept their names similar, just for my own brain too, but for people who were reading so that, it was something that would stick in their minds later on when they were actually thinking about Garbo, the real spy. Um, but I do the same thing too. It's funny, Jane, you and I have very similar methods for picking names because I also really pay attention to the first letter of the names and try
Mhm.
not to replicate that too much because it's very confusing. Similar sounding names in the same book can be very confusing to readers. Yeah.
Exactly. And the other thing I think about is like culturally, like Gia in the book is Italian, so obviously culturally, like what is an Italian name that would fit, things like that as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
I loved Gia.
Thank you.
Great character. So somebody asks, and this is a really good question because both of your books kind of will have to do with code breaking. What did the code breakers tell their families about what they were doing since they were not allowed? And I want to add, when you read the book, whenever Bob has to talk to any of the team, he has to put in a disclaimer about what will happen to them if they do tell anything about their work. So they have to
Right.
be super careful, right, Jane?
Yeah, I mean, they could end up in jail for treason or even be executed for if they revealed any of their secrets to anyone outside the organization. So they told their families that they were secretaries. A lot of their family thought they were secretaries, I mean, it was pretty. good cover for women back in those times. No one really guessed. And then, reading about Angelina Nani, I mentioned, and some of these other articles, when these, grandkids, nieces and nephews came along, and they'd be like, I started putting things together and I knew she wasn't a secretary. I knew she did more than just secretarial work back in the day. And then when they started actually honoring some of these women more recently, that's, whether they had passed on or not, that was another, the families were shocked because these women never discussed it with, husbands or, sisters, brothers, parents, anyone.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I know that they got from the book that they got a lot of pushback from their families too because they didn't go down the right path for them. They weren't getting married and having babies. So in one of the lines that I remember very distinctly, somebody said, that their family was really pushing them because they were like, you're like, it doesn't make sense for you to be a secretary when you should be doing this. So did they like in real life, did they get a lot of pushback, do you think?
I think it really, in terms of like research, it depended on it depended on the family. Like, it depended on the how progressive the parents were of these young women who were going off to Washington, D.C. to live on their own. And I mean, there was one, it might have been Jean Gerbiel, and there's a Jean in the book who's based on Jean Gerbiel, but she was a home economics teacher in rural Virginia, and she hated it. She hated the
Mm-hmm.
job. And her father was like, go find a life. Like, you go to DC and find a life. And even if you're just pencil pushing, as he called it, whatever, at least you're like getting out of rural Virginia and not teaching home economics, which you hate. So it kind of just, it depended, I think, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And did you find that too, Suzanne, when you were writing your books about the pressures that were on women to conform?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, my two, the two main characters in Librarians of Lisbon, one is a disowned heiress, and the reason she's disowned is because she breaks off her engagement to a man that she finds, she just finds deplorable. And then B, is she's a genius in her own right. She has a photographic memory. She's the librarian at the Boston Public Library, but her mother has died and she's kind of borne the financial burden of her family for a very long time. But her younger brother is deployed overseas in World War II. And she follows her best friend, Celine, to Lisbon to try to protect her
Mm.
initially. But she has this amazing mind, and really the opportunities just open up exponentially when she gets to Lisbon for her with her abilities with code breaking. And then the world that she thought she was kind of pigeonholed in Boston, which was relatively small, just explodes and she has all these new opportunities and then it just completely changes the course of her life. So, um, yes, I think women during that time period, oh my gosh, if I'd been alive during that, I mean, I think about my grandmothers and Jane, your grandmothers, and
Hmm.
one of my grandmothers had 8 children, and what if she'd been given the opportunity to say, no, I
Right.
don't want to be a farmer's wife and have, 8 children. I want to go overseas and see the world.
Yeah.
I don't know. I might have taken that up.
Right.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah. I mean, and it's nice that you're both writing about women, the stories of women that we haven't heard before because they weren't told before. There was, historically. So that's really, I love that. And Jane, we've talked about this a lot. Is that you do bring out like the hidden stories that that we just weren't aware of that make a fuller picture of history. Terry asks, what surprised you the most in your research and in your writing of the book? I'm gonna start with Jane about this one.
What surprised me the most, I'm trying to think about, well, I think that and this is not a spoiler, like the fact some of the breakthroughs that this little kind of underdog group made were really changed the trajectory of history. They really did track down all of these spies in the United States that were stealing nuclear secrets. Like you can't can't get higher stakes than that. And that was, and I think Suzanne, you can probably speak to this too. Like when you learn a story about like that, and you're like, it's so massive. It like the repercussions of it were so massive, and yet like someone's definitely written a novel about this. Like that's what I kept thinking. Like the hairs go up on the back of your neck, and you're like, this is such a good story. There's got to be a book about this out there already. And that was kind of what kind of drove me to finally figure out a way to write it. Because I just thought this is extraordinary that this group has not really gotten the recognition they deserve. And part of it, I think, is because it was so secret, and there's still not all the information about the Venona Project has come out. And it came out only in 95, like I've said a couple times. Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you, Suzanne? Was there anything surprising in your research?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say for me, once I started diving into um, the setting of Lisbon and Portugal during World War II, one, I hadn't really realized what role it played in the war until I started really doing proper research. And when I realized it was neutral, but I also realized it was run by a prime minister who was basically functioning as a dictator and had really severe restrictions on who he was allowing into the country after 1940. That just blew my mind. And then I learned about Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who was this incredible man who just defied the law, Circular 14, which the dictator Salazar had put into place, which basically said like stateless persons were not allowed into Portugal anymore. And he was in Bordeaux, France at the time, and he just completely ignored Salazar's orders and signed thousands and thousands and thousands of visas, letting people into Portugal in June of 1940 when France was being invaded by the Nazis. And he went unrecognized until the late 1980s when Israel recognized him for the first time as a man among nations. And that just also, I knew I had to incorporate him into the story, and I fictionalized his character. But again, I mean, what Jane spoke to, it's the same thing that someone who did something that incredible would go unrecognized for that length of time, because of Salazar's censorship and what he did with the media to control it. It's terrifying, and astounding.
Hmm.
So.
Then
So
sounds,
fascinating.
yeah. So last question, I'm going to start with you, Suzanne, is can you talk about your cover a little bit? Marcia would like to know, and I always think covers are really interesting. Do you have a lot of input into it?
Oh.
Did what, how did
This
you,
cover, this one.
yeah.
So I did actually have a little bit of input. It depends on who you're working with. I will say, sometimes because I was a children's book editor for a long time too. So sometimes authors don't have any input at all. But if you're lucky, you do get some input. So my editor asked me about this cover, and I said, well, it can basically go one of two ways. You can do, the background, a really beautiful background with the cityscape of Lisbon, and then, a woman in the foreground with, like the sun setting and warplanes and stuff, and her holding a book because she's a librarian. Or you could go for like the bodice ripping, man bending over her in this luscious gown, holding a book with Lisbon in the background.
Nice.
Because there's a little bit of romance in this one. And I just remember Haley saying, yeah, I think we're gonna go with the cityscape and the really pretty librarian holding
Nice.
the book.
Well, I have to say, I mean, I know that we had said that Librarians of Lisbon is like a true chili pepper book, but if you're gonna market it as a historical fiction, that I mean,
Right.
I get mad like if I see like a book that the cover is just like absolutely nothing like the actual book. So I'm glad you
Right.
went with that cover.
I am too. I think it's totally gorgeous. And I was so happy with it when I saw it for the first time. I just thought it was breathtaking. So I got really lucky.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's a
good.
beautiful cover. I love it.
How about you, Jane? I know you have sort of like the classic woman walking away thing, but I love the little, this
Woman.
is so dumb of me, like not dumb, but like a librarian of me. I love that little thing up in the corner with it's like a book page,
Yeah,
right?
oh, the little like it's like a little code. It's a little code breaking thing, like a little nod to the code breaking aspect of it. And yeah, so the original this time out, I had a new editor. She didn't realize like that my last books, they would send me like two or three different concepts. And this time they only sent me one concept, and it was not this book. It was not this cover. it was just like it was a woman with a whole different color hair that was not the same color as the character. Her clothes were kind of dowdy and she was just like on a street and I was like I'm sorry, like what? I don't understand. Like, what does this say about Women of Arlington Hall? Like, and they took my feedback. I'm like, I want it to. It doesn't have to be in front of Arlington Hall, but I want it to look like it's in Washington D.C. I want her hair color to be right. Can we not do red? Because I feel like there's a lot of red dresses and women walking away in red dresses. And can we like make the fashion? Correct for the time period. And so I actually love this one. And I love that she's like, near the Capitol building and all that. And yeah, I think it fits.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
If you don't mind staying for one more minute, I do want to ask this last question because it's so fascinating. When you guys were researching your books, did it cause you at all to reflect on what's happening in the current world of spies in the 21st century with computers and AI?
Wow.
Suzanne?
I think that, I mean, I'm doing a lot of research right now for my next work in progress, which I really can't say very much about, except that it's also based in World War II. But I think researching World War II in general has made me think a lot about what, current events and what is going on in our world. Especially, with all the research that I did regarding Lisbon and censorship. When I was in Lisbon, we went to the Aljube prison, which is now a museum of resistance and freedom. And they had a whole display about what Salazar did with censorship. And it just showed there was a whole case that just showed newspapers and letters and interdepartmental notices that had just been completely blacked out and censored. And that was where he drew a lot of his power. So I do think a lot about that, especially with regard to AI too, because I think that there's something to be said about the elimination of information and the removal of information, what you're taking away from people, but then also what you're giving to them under false pretenses and under the guise of accuracy, but it's really not.
That's really so true. Current times. Jane, how about you? Do you just stay in the history or do you look towards where we are and where we're going?
No, I mean, I think that you can't help it, to some degree, and I think that like Suzanne mentioned, tomorrow is the 80th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki's on the 9th, and I've been thinking about how this generation. I mean, I learned about that in the history books. I learned about that in history. I've read about it. I think it was more at the forefront of the culture, the bomb, the atomic bomb, and when we got the bomb, when the Rush in 45, when the Russians got the atomic bomb in 49, and I think that the talk of nuclear capabilities today, younger people don't understand what the
Mhm.
world went through at the end of World War II and the horrors, frankly, of not only not, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also what happened here when they tested the bomb in 45. There was 200 million Americans that were impacted by the radiation, that were living in the area near Los Alamos when they tested the atomic bomb, and that isn't talked about enough. So yeah, I think about that a lot. I think about that, some of this history we need reminders sometimes.
Mhm. Yeah, and we've talked about this too, is that historical fiction is such an accessible way for people to learn about history without it being intimidating or boring. So
Mhm.
really appreciate that as well. Oh my gosh, this has been so wonderful. I am so thankful to you both for writing and for sharing your stories with us and for coming here tonight and talking about your books. Suzanne, thank you for excellent moderation.
Of
Thank
course.
you.
Thank you, Jane. I'm so excited about your book. Yay!
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne and Mina. You both are the best. And I always say one of the best parts of author life is all of like the friends I made along the way. I'm like so grateful to friends like you both. So thank you for doing this tonight.
So true.
Well,
So true.
I know you're busy on your book tour, so I appreciate you making the time. But for everybody who's been here, wonderful discussion and questions, and I really appreciate all your time in hanging out with us tonight. And Jane and Suzanne, I will be in touch. Have a wonderful night. Jane, have a really great end of your book tour. I do want to mention, I don't know if it's still there. Is your book still at the top of Times Square?
No, it was there till yesterday. So now, yeah, but I have lots of pictures because it'll never happen again. So
Oh, it might. It might. You are on the rise. But yeah, check out Jane's social media, because seeing the Women of Arlington Hall up in Times Square was, for me, a thrill, and I just know you.
Yeah, that was crazy. All right. Thank you so much for all your support. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. Have a great night.
Yep. Good
Thank
night, everybody.
you.
Take
Good
care.
night.
Bye-bye.